as a Molinist, I do argue for exhaustive divine predestination of all things, but that is far different than exhaustive divine determination of all things, because then God cares about, did you say cow farts? Is that what he said?
Cow farts.
Is that what he said?
Pritchett says every cow that farts or something like that, every flatulence.
That sounds like a Pritchett thing.
God predetermined it.
Yeah. Now look, God creating a world in which he knew the cow was going to fart. Naturally, not God, you could say that.
Is this going to be the new chapter? You're going to have a new chapter in your book called Cow Farts?
I think I will.
Dedicated to Jonathan Pritchett.
Yeah. And I say that God chooses worlds best on the best feasible, freedom permitting end game with eternity in mind. So if the cow fart happens to come along for the ride, and that an omniscient God knows it's going to happen, he's not surprised by it, but it's not like he's like, see, I'm going to make the cow fart right here. He doesn't make it happen. And his decree isn't deterministic. He just knows it's going to happen. So,
which gets them all into the knowledge is not causal, and we don't.
Yeah, right.
God knows something doesn't mean he has to be the one who's the source of it or the determiner of it. Yeah,
right. The problem is with exhaustive divine determination, because that word determined involves antecedent conditions sufficient to necessitate, and as soon as you get that, then one of the things I have in my notes here for you is, and I think around the 29-minute mark, he frames the debate. Jeremiah does as well. What view glorifies God more? Well, I'll tell you what, it's not Calvinism. It's not Ed Calvinism, because Ed Calvinism, as I've explained, I think you kind of gave it a hat tip. It entails that God determines everybody's false theological beliefs. And since the Calvinist, and I even asked this to James White in our debate, I think I asked him, I said, are you infallible regarding all your theological beliefs? And he said, no, nobody is. I'm like, great, we agree. So now, if everybody affirms at least one false theological belief, if not multitudes, and God determines everything, well, it logically follows that God causally determines everybody to affirm false theological beliefs, including all Calvinists. But if that's the case, as J.P. Moreland and I discussed in the paper that we published back in the end of 2022, that leads to epistemic meltdown, making theological knowledge impossible. That means that you could not know that God is trustworthy. You could not know that the Bible is trustworthy. You could not know that Calvinism is true, and you could not possess knowledge of that you have assurance of salvation. It's all destroyed, and because ultimately it makes God a deity of deception, even if he deceives everybody for morally sufficient reasons. So, yeah, when you ask what view brings God more glory, it is anything but Calvinism. At least if one's going to affirm exhaustive divine.
And that was one of my last questions towards him was, him to affirm that God decreed for me not to accept unconditional election as a proper biblical doctrine. And he affirmed that was the case, but he still said, you're responsible, of course, as he would.
And how?
And so on what basis am I responsible? But
and I would just say, what could you do, Leighton, if God determines you to affirm the false theological belief that Calvinism is not true? Is there anything you can do? Because now it's necessitated. If God determines it, it's necessitated. That means you're powerless. There is absolutely nothing you can do. How does that make you responsible?
Yeah, and that's I think the Achilles heel, and even Calvin admits that he's ignorant, and he says he's meditated on these things so long that he's not afraid to confess ignorance, and it's on that very point how we're culpable and God's not. He just doesn't know. He just accepts it for what it is, and so kind of they're throwing up their hands to this controversial, if not contradictory, claim that God's responsible for those things that you're held responsible for. And when I pressed him on that, I said, how can God be trustworthy if he's ordaining for everybody in this audience who agrees with me and myself, who you think are brothers? You've called me a brother throughout we're children of God. We're redeemed, regenerated children of God. And you believe that God has decreed for us to interpret his word wrongly and to dismiss something that you think is a very important doctrine, i.e. unconditional election. How can God be trustworthy if that's the case? I don't remember his exact answer to that. We'll go back and listen to it. But he basically just kind of goes on talking about you're starting with man or something like that. I think was his answer.
No, we're starting with logic.
Yeah,
which is grounded in
scripture and logic. Yes,
right.
But I still haven't. I've still not heard a sufficient answer that at least satisfies me to any level, except to just to plead to mystery and or to feign disbelief that you would even ask the question, or to say that, oh, well, you're the interlocutor in Paul's mind.
Well,
that's the other question begging claim you'll get so often.
So do you remember what James White said to me? You were in the front row of that debate, Leighton. And I pressed the first version of this argument, I think, ever publicly in that debate with James White. And it's evolved and become more precise since. But James White just ignored the argument and never responded to it in the debate. And afterwards in videos, you know what his response was? Tim, you need to apologize for offering this argument.
Why? What was his reasoning for apologizing?
Because it shows that on his view, God is a deity of deception. And if God's a deity of deception, even for morally sufficient reasons, and that means he's the source of everybody's false theological beliefs, including James White's false theological beliefs, since James White won't affirm to be a super pope. You know, he's right about that. And he'll say that there's no such thing as a super pope who is infallible and holds a perfect set of theological beliefs. That means that everybody is determined by God to affirm false theological beliefs. That means that God is the source of everybody's false theological beliefs, and it's everybody, every single person. Yeah. And so now you don't stand in a position to know which of your views God has determined you to get right and which of your views God has determined you to get wrong. And there's nothing you can do to change it because these are necessitated now. And so, so then he told me to apologize because I demonstrated that on his view, God becomes a deity of deception. And if God's a deity of deception and he inspired all of Scripture, why should you trust anything in Scripture? Now this leads to epistemic meltdown because we have reason to doubt. It's called an undercutting defeater in epistemology. Yes. We have reason to doubt everything in the Bible. And that includes their interpretation that gets them to Calvinism. That includes
what's worse than that, it leads you to doubt God.
It does.
Why would you believe and why would you want to worship a God you believe does that to most of his children? Because most people don't accept Calvinistic theology. Right. Even the Calvinists don't admission. Most people who come to faith don't accept it necessarily, and they certainly don't believe all things that are accurate and correct theologically. So all of them, like you said, affirm something that's false. Why would God do that to his own children? Right. That doesn't make any rational sense.
Yeah.
And I think you make a good logical case precisely for that. C.S. Lewis made a similar case. You might remember that, talking about if his black is our white, and we can worship we know not what. Mm-hmm. He even goes on to talk about that. He even calls it you worshiping a all-powerful demon is basically right. What he called it. And it's exactly the deity of deception concept that you're introducing is exactly what C.S. Lewis, and he does it in more flowery, really poetic kind of language.
Right.
Whereas you do it more as a logical, you do it as more of a logical, precise argument, you and Moreland do. But it's an argument that's been probably around even in before Augustine, back when they were fighting the Gnostics. You can read Polycarp and several of the other guys who were fighting the Gnostics at the time, and they're making similar type of arguments about God being made into this monstrous being who's bringing about the very things that he's condemning. It's something that White treats it as if it's just this new argument that Leighton Flowers made up. And I'm like going, bro, this has been around since long before Augustine even came on the scene. And many of them won't deal with it.
Yeah. It's a problem when somebody says, oh, you're like you mentioned earlier, you're just using human logic here. That sounds so woke. It's about as bad as some of these professors we saw back in 2020 saying math is racist, or logic is racist. It's like, it's not human logic. It is principles of reason grounded in our Creator, and that is what we're appealing to. And so, when Lewis says if our black can be God's white or whatever, that is a rejection of logic, a rejection of the Logos. And I'm not going to do that.
Well, and it's just, and a lot of times it's saying, well, it's a categorical difference. You'll hear a lot of that in order to say there's a different sense in which this is true of God, but not true of us, and all these kinds of things. So whatever case you can make against the Calvinistic argument, they can always just use this categorical distinction that they basically have invented it, as far as I can tell. And sometimes they may make a legitimate categorical distinction, but I'm always looking for the biblical categorical distinction. In other words, if there's a categorical distinction that Paul's making, he's typically pretty good about explaining those things, or talking about, for example, when he's talking about Hagar and Sarah, and he says, I'm speaking figuratively here, giving you two different, senses in which I'm speaking about this. He tells us that when he's intending to communicate things like that. And so I just think it's really dangerous whenever you approach Scripture with that kind of loose way of just dismissing things using categorical or language to say it's true in this sense but not in this sense, and then you're arbitrarily, I guess, one who gets to choose when something's been taken this way or that way.
Hey, don't click out yet. Seriously, if you like this little snippet, you're gonna love the full episode. It's linked right there in the description. Go watch it when you're done here, or tap on one of these video recommendations for more stuff like this. If you're enjoying the content, a like and subscribe would mean the world, and it doesn't cost you anything. It helps us out a ton. Drop a comment too. Tell us what you thought. Thanks for hanging out. We'll catch you in the full vid.